So, first off, always make sure your phone's on silent before you give it to them. You will have somebody who thinks it's funny to call you. They've done it twice. So, I'm here to talk to you about actually working in open source, not only just in open source, but possibly as a product. So, do this for a day job, in case you're not already doing this. So, let me explain a little bit about myself and where I come from. Just a couple of years ago, I was actually working in a medical billing company as VP of Technical Operations, which meant that I handled all of the IT, I did process reviews, I made sure the company was running efficiently. However, everything I did was company secret. And when I say everything, I mean everything. I could not print out a copy of the manual I wrote and take it home. But in my spare time, I was working with a distribution called Arch Linux ARM because I had an apartment where I wasn't allowed to run wires, and I didn't want to run a whole server, so I got a little box that had a Wi-Fi chip in it. The problem was it wasn't supported, and all of a sudden I had a keen interest in getting back into Linux because I wanted that to work just so I could watch all of my TV shows. Now, fast forward a few years at that point, and I actually got laid off. Was this a good thing? In the end, I think so. I spent 9 months unemployed, but I did, however, get a lot of experience working in open communities and building my experience working with the kernel and the userland. I needed to make some money at some point, so I had to go work for a bank. I will never work for a bank again. Not because the work wasn't challenging, but I could not stand the organizational size. I was working for a top 5 bank in the world. My department, before the nearest department head that had any value in the company, was 5,000. There was no way I was going up in any way, shape, or form. I didn't see myself having true room to grow. So I continued to work with open source tools there, but I also spent time getting to know the community, getting myself involved. This screen went off, so I couldn't read my slides. That figures. However, then I went to a conference, similar to the one we have here, but focused specifically on open source tools and Linux itself. There I had a 30-minute conversation with a fellow who was making a device, and he was having problems with it, but I had been working with these devices in my spare time for 2 years. I walked up to him, I asked him, oh, is this it? Are you using this port? Are you going to leave this exposed? And he looks at me, we have a conversation. At the end of the conversation, he says, where were you when I was hiring 9 months ago? 9 months ago was before I was working for the bank, and I was literally sitting at home, doing nothing. That was great, because now I got to work as a distribution manager. We made a Linux-based thin client, so I got to actually build, on top of the Octo project, build a Linux OS that worked on multiple pieces of hardware and bleeding-edge hardware at that, so I got to play kernel drivers, graphics, and all kinds of interesting things. But it also meant I was now more proliferate in open source. I was making commits in all kinds of projects. I was fixing Docker and FreeRDP and OpenSSL, because I needed these things fixed for my customers. I'm not going to get paid if my customer's not happy. My customer's not happy because the software's broken. Guess what I have to fix? I loved that job, but in the end, I decided I needed to move forward. I may have hit as far as I could go. The only person's job I could take was the CTO. That one's a hard job to take, isn't it? So, now, I work for GitLab. I'm a software engineer, but I'm specifically in the distribution team. Does anybody know what that means? No. I'm not surprised. We have a very specific niche of things that we do, but it has to do with how we actually package this large application suite and give it to customers and users to actually make use of. And it's not just what we use, but it's what you guys use, and it's the exact same product. So whether it's you with a Raspberry Pi, you with 10 servers, or us with hundreds of thousands of servers, that same product has to work for all of us at the same time in the exact same way. It's a very complex problem that you actually have to think about every day. But now, the biggest part for me, the biggest bonus I have is I went from a completely proprietary environment to one where everything I do all day long is 100% open, visible, and transparent. So I want to teach you guys a little bit of the lessons that I've learned in doing this. So I'll cover plenty of this. Please don't need to read the slides. But first you need to understand what FOSS is, and I think most of you here probably have a good idea of what free and open source software is. But do you really understand how it works, how to work in a global team? Because this one's key. Do you understand what it means to have a product that's actually based on this, and then possibly have that product be in the open, have that be open source, and how you can actually maintain that while still maintaining an actual viable business model? So we have to cover how you actually do your work, how your licenses will work out, and maybe some reasoning on why you would choose one license or another. But we also have to think about the business case, right? If you're a business, you're not one person. Well, maybe you are for a short time, but ideally, you now have more people that get to do the things you do, they get to enjoy what you do, and also contribute to the communities that we're a part of. How do you actually do this? The last one, of course, comes down to talent. The people in this room, people not in this room, the people on the other side of the planet. So, everybody knows the basic communication methods, right? Forums. Everybody seen that tank? Yeah. We've all enjoyed forum posts where you have no idea what just happened, but we went from discussion to flame war to half a discussion to something else. Right? Forums are generally public by default. There's a reason for this. You need to have a way for your users to communicate with you in the clear, but you also need to have a way for you to communicate with your team in a way that your users will be able to understand. Right? So a traditional forum is one method, but there's also many other ways. Mailing lists that are public, issue trackers, all of these methodologies actually give you ways to do this. Public and private, I bring this one up here because who works in security? That's the one you don't want to screw up. Do not post security fixes before they're actually released. That's why private exists. Or when you have a customer that has a customer base that covers the entire planet, they don't really want everything they talk about in the public. But eventually they may open it up and you can make it public again. The biggest thing is be open to direct, real feedback, both from yourselves and your customers, but everybody in between, because you will be seen if you react poorly because you got offended, because somebody called you out on making a mistake. But direct feedback, honest feedback, is something that is to be truly valued from a customer or a coworker or some guy on the other side of the planet you'll never meet again. Then you have, how are you actually going to communicate? Right? Seems straightforward, right? But think about it. If you communicate primarily over IRC, how many people don't have IRC, don't understand IRC, or don't understand how to be persistently on IRC? Do your customers know how to do this? Do new users in the ecosystem know how to do this? No. As an internet vet, this is, dink. 5 seconds, I'm back on my WeChat, and I don't care. But the guy that just came from a random post on Hacker News that wants to try your stuff out, who has no idea what IRC is not going to go join a room off the channel and make sure he's got it registered next so he can get in because of all the spam bots. You still have options like, God forbid, Slack or Link. They're proprietary platforms, okay. But they're platforms that are public, that have a recorded history, that many people can access on many devices, whether that's a low-end phone, a high-end phone, whether they have a server at home or not. You can actually get everybody to be there. When they're there, though, it might be different from you're there. Asynchronous communication, right? We're familiar with this in forum posts. We are. We're familiar with it with emails. You send a message, you wait for the person to respond. You don't send a message, wait 5 seconds, send another message, wait 5 more seconds, send it. Right? That guy is going to despise you if you do this to him. The world is not built on Pacific US Coast time. Okay, it's not around Silicon Valley. You cannot assume whether your team is based here in Europe or based in the US that you will work within this time zone or within this time zone. When you truly develop a distributed team like we have at GitLab, we're covering every time zone on the planet, which means there's overlap. But generally speaking, I can send a message and I can wait 12 hours before my intermediate in Australia answers my question. So I have to expect delays, right? One, they're not in the same room. This is different. You have to get used to that. So let's actually look at how the experience actually is. Now, I'm going to say this. Does everyone understand the concept of knowing your audience? Right? Right? You want to know if you're talking to a room full of technical people. You want to know if you're talking to a room of people who had barely installed their first copy of Ubuntu. Right? There's a big difference between this is a system architect who's been deploying Kubernetes from 1.0 and I installed Ubuntu, but they're just as respectable at either point, and you need to know how to communicate with that group, whatever that group is. I have a whole separate talk on being aware of who you're talking to and making sure that you're good there. I will provide that link if anybody wants it. But the important part when you're doing this communication is to use clear and concise language. Not everyone is going to speak your language at all, or by default as their first language. Especially for me, I hit that barrier very early. I had to learn the difference between my New York area fast talking and just zipping through consonants and slow myself down, make sure that people actually understood what I said, and be very, very careful of colloquialisms or phrases that are very specific to the areas that you're from. Because people outside of where you're from don't know the meaning of, hey y'all, you get it because you've seen it in movies, but there are far, far longer sets of words that just don't make any sense to the people that don't live in your hometown. The second thing is, because this may not be that other person's first language, remember that you actually have to consider that you may have to rephrase it a few times. That's not an insult to either party. It might simply be that there is a communication barrier that is very simply not being familiar with it. And oftentimes, when I rephrase, I have inadvertently used one of those sets of words that doesn't make sense out of where I live. And all of a sudden I go, oh, whoops, did that again. Now, I mentioned this again before, but I'll say it yet again. There are times then that things can be private discussions, right? Security concerns, personnel issues, right? These make perfect sense to keep that way, especially in our circles. We've all seen that maybe Linus should not have sent that particular set of words to the internet because email has context. The press read one sentence, right? But whenever possible, be open by default. Communicate in the public by whichever means you choose, whether it's going through your email, going through Slack, going through public forum posts, your change logs. Whenever possible, tell people that it's there, that they can go read it, and if they want to understand a decision, here's all of the discussion and the documentation. Not, well, we made this decision, you have to live with it. Office, the ribbon. Who thought that was a good idea? I don't know, some marketing guy, some product manager thought it was a great idea. But I don't know about you, but 2007 through 2013, I didn't really understand where anything is in that program anymore. Write it down, okay? This is a very simple and it's very straightforward, and I have other GitLabbers in the audience. What happens when we don't write things down? Does anybody remember that conversation we had 2 weeks ago? We talked about this. I could swear we did. Did we write it down? Write it down not only for your customers, but for your own use. The beauty of it being transparent is when you actually put it in an issue, you put it in words, you can look it up. Even if you have to do a Google search on your own site, done it a lot, you can actually find out where the decision came from, how the technical pieces of the product came together. So, work patterns, right? Everybody knows how they work. Does everybody work the same way? If I see one nod yes, you're all wrong. Okay, there's no way that two people work the same. Even two people in the same set of cubes right next to each other don't work identically every day. But you need to understand what's required to be able to work in this kind of environment, in this global, everybody can truly contribute environment. You have multiple options available to you. We use Slack, but if it is ever a conversation that matters, that has to be moved to an issue. That's a default behavior that we have because it has to be written down. You need to be able to create the issues, you need to be able to define what the problem is, therefore you can discuss it, therefore you can show others where the process came along. From that, if you actually need to make code changes or even just change the handbook, you'll branch, right? So we work in source control all the time, obviously doing what we do. And I think most of you also do in some ways. We just take it to a rather large extreme. You'll make your branch, you'll do the work, and while you're doing this, we're making changes and we're pushing those changes regularly. We're not waiting until it's done. I've passed all the tests, I've written everything, I know it's good. Here, put it out there, show that you're working on it, show where you're thinking as you go. It doesn't have to work and pass every test. You're putting it out there so that other people can actually come and see what it is and how it's working, and if that's to the plan that you agreed upon, or if they see a better way to do it in the middle of it. Which is better? 5 days of work, scrap it, or 1 day of work, maybe we can change that a bit, and on day 3, instead of getting to the end of day 5 and writing all of your tests, you're going, actually, this is better. And now you can actually make a product that fits everybody's needs instead of just where your engineers thought it needed to go. That iteration is important, but you can't have that at that speed if you don't do it transparently. This is one thing I need to remind everybody in this room, whether you know it or not. You are not your code. Your code is your work product. There's a difference. Okay? A review from somebody is not a bad thing. This is good. This is you actually working with someone and making sure that everybody believes and understands where the decisions and the product is actually going. But that means you have to understand that everything is thus open to discussion. Sometimes it's right. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you don't know until you're 3 days in. The last thing I want to point out in this one when it comes to work patterns is understand that we work in software. The great thing about computers is they do exactly what we tell them. Can anybody tell me the bad thing about computers?
Exactly what we tell them.
Exactly. It's the exact same thing. They do exactly what you told them to do, which could have been an oversight, could have been overzealous, who knows? No software is ever finished, so this process is going to happen over and over and over again until the end of time. And if you don't believe me, anybody seen Office? When's the last time we had a best version ever out of Microsoft Office? I think it was this year, and the year before that, and the year before that. Yeah, you get the point. Okay, so I had one screen that updated and one did not. That's confusing. And I'm going to keep talking about this, is being open about what you actually decide, right? Working in the open can be harder than it seems because you are putting things out there for people to actually question while you're making the decision. Live, it can be off-putting at first. But I can tell you that there are certainly some examples out here that have done very well. Write it down as you make your decisions. Don't do it behind closed doors and come out with a product. That's not open source. Accept your feedback. Whether it's reviews or your customers are like, you know what? I don't want a micro OS. I already know how this works. Right? That's an example of accepting feedback, even if it's not from anyone within your team. Some things can and should be private, right? Financial data, customer data, security information, these things should be private. Probably the things that you use for doing large deployments if you also have a SaaS built on top of the same product. But the beauty of this situation is, when we stop and look at this, is those customers, whether you want to think of them as customers or community members or whichever else, if somebody is not involved in the design of the project but is using the project, technically they're a customer. They just may not be paying you anything, right? Now, who's going to know the user's needs best? The user. It's simple, it's straightforward, but sometimes we forget. This is my tool, I know what I'm doing, this is what I needed to do. This is great. But when some dude goes, you know, if you could add a TAC W to the end and I could get a wider output format, that would be great. You might think, well, nobody would ever need that, but that person obviously could make use of it. That's not a bad thing. Then you have the joys of bug reports. Who's gotten that vague, I don't know, but it's not working? Right? It could be a printer, could be a web page, could be the web page for their printer. If they say, I don't know, and I respond with, okay, what are you using to print? I'm starting them down the process of debugging. Now, not every single piece of software will be something that the user can directly debug. Firmware is just not one of those things. But if I tell them, yeah, this page is probably slow because you have 35 posts of cat pictures and you're waiting for all of it to come down, I can tell them, you know, open the developer console and look at the network tab and see what happens. Right? It seems like straightforward. But if you're writing everything down as you go, and you're accepting feedback and doing it publicly, other people can learn to investigate their own problems based on the ones that others have seen. As a result, your own direct support and your developer time, your highly trained engineer time, is now able to be more focused on the engineering instead of helping users. Having your customers being able to access the key components of your application because it's open source means they can actually debug their own problems. Seems odd if you've ever worked in proprietary. Why would you do this? Why would you show someone the secret sauce? Stop making it hard for them to do their jobs, because they probably have highly trained engineers who want to do it to help you out, because they just want it to work for their users too. Here comes the fun part. Open source software has a license on everything, right? We have to know which ones exist. We have to know what they protect. Do they protect the user? Do they protect my work? Do they protect the users of my work in the future? And how do these all work? But it also affects how you actually interact with your community, because if it's an MIT or a BSD license, you've got one outlook. If you've got a GPL or a GPL variant, you have another outlook. And there are a few others that we'll cover in a second. But we need to know how they affect user accessibility. If I have a GPL license and a user takes that and modifies code, who benefits from that? Because there's a restriction in there that requires them to publish those changes back. If I have an MIT license, which does not require that you publish those changes back, heck, you don't even have to tell me you made changes, right? But there's a difference in how those viewpoints on freedom work. Neither one's invalid, but they're different, and they then can affect how your work is done. That's where you need to know then the fun parts of working in various pieces of software that are owned or stewarded by a company. Do you need a CLA or a contributor license agreement? Anybody familiar with what that is? Yeah? You got to sign the paper, fax it back. Okay. No, really, you're going to own this. Because if I do this way, because of your license, it gets weird. But then we have an alternative, which is the developer certificate of origin, which is what GitLab actually switched to because we recognized how hard it was to properly maintain community interaction using a CLA. Then here comes the fun part of, can I make this my own? Right? Because some people are going to try and do that. Right? They're going to fork it. They're going to try to make a service out of it. Who knows? But how does that license that you chose affect that kind of behavior? Things you have to think about when you work in open source, or when you want to make a product that is open source but still pays everybody's bills.
Sorry, can you tell us what a developer certificate of origin is, or how is it different from a CLA?
A CLA is actually essentially a binding agreement that says that when I make these changes, you actually own them. A developer certificate of origin actually states, I wrote this code, but I have permission from any other entity to write this code and put it out there. Basically, if you work for a company that says, we own all of the code that you write, the DCO says, I've been allowed an exception to write this code and put it out there for other use. Whereas the CLA says, your company agrees that you're writing code for me. So there's a little bit of a difference in the way it works. Good question. So, from a business aspect, do you know how these licenses actually work? Right? I mentioned BSDs, variations in the GPLs. Anybody ever heard of the bacon license? That's literally a license that says, I don't care what you do with it, but if you use it, or you modify it, you have to send me a pound of bacon. That's the license on the code. It's mostly there as a joke, but the guy has received a few hundred pounds. I mean, hey, I hope you like it, right? And there's actually a WTFPL. Yes, that is the acronym you think. Because he wants you to be able to do whatever you want with that publicly. It doesn't matter if you modify it, you rip the license off, he doesn't care. That's literally what the license says, is just do whatever. But from a business perspective, and this is the one that people seem to forget sometimes in the greater community, is that BOSS does not mean it was free. Somebody had to put the time in, somebody had to put in the costs, somebody had to put in the capital expenditures to make sure people actually had space to work, machines to work on. The way you make money from open source software is not the same as a traditional proprietary system. You're not charging somebody a license to use it so long as you deem it valid, right? There's a big difference in the way these work. GitLab is an open core product. We're MIT based, and we have a still visible but licensed piece of the code base. Other systems are entirely GPL, or even a Pharaoh GPL, which I wouldn't have made that choice, but again, that's the beauty of having the choices that we have in the communities that we have. So, we're almost done here, but remember what I told about customers? Your customers actually are contributors, right? They're going to give you direct feedback on what the problems are, how they tried to resolve it, could they manage to fix it? I need you to make this better in this way. And in some cases, they actually self-resolve their own tickets. I've got two guys that are not from the engineering team, and they can tell you that yes, really, this happens when it's public. Sometimes, for those of us from the engineering team, there are people that actually come and solve your problems. You know, your engineers have been fighting with something, but they come in from a completely different viewpoint and solve it in a day. And you're like, I spent a week on this because they were able to provide a perspective that you didn't have. And that comes back to that being open, being clear about it, and showing how the decisions work. Maybe somebody's going to come in a week later, or you know, this in particular case was 2 months later, and then it was raised as a bug, and we were trying to address it for an entire week, and then somebody goes, oh yeah, here. Well, that just saved me a lot of money trying to fix. And again, those customers, your community members, they know their needs better than anybody else. They will tell you what those needs are. Are you willing to actually listen? So here comes the easy part at the end of the talk. Anybody know how you get started in one of these businesses? How you make it a day job? It's simple. Businesses will benefit if you already know the product. If they have an open source product and you've been a contributor and you can show you're familiar with their code base, they don't have to train you. They will very happily hire you right away. You already know what's necessary, you're already familiar with everything, and a lot of these places don't care if you live here or the US or Australia. In our case, 50-something countries and climbing. We can hire based on the best skill capabilities instead of having to worry, how do I get these people here? How do I actually move everybody to this one massive office that nobody wants to go to? Yeah, there's giggles, but that's like legit. The biggest benefit most of our employees see is we can say, I don't care where you live. And that's the best part. That comes down to you actually becoming the talent. The people that a business like I work for wants to hire. If you want to do this, one, you're already here, okay? And I don't care what you're doing or where. If you have an interest in it, you're already here and listening, you're already taking the first steps. But get involved. It doesn't matter if it's documentation, that's contribution. It doesn't matter if it's helping people resolve their issues because you are better equipped than they are to be able to solve this weird configuration error, or you know, maybe you should double your Postgres cache size because your performance sucks. Those are issue resolutions that are of value, right? And it doesn't matter if you're an engineer, or you're in support, or you're a sysadmin, or a UX, or a technical writer. All of these things are actual contributions that the open source business will see value in. But to do this, you need to demonstrate that you have some of the communication habits that I've already talked about earlier. You need to have those. You need to be able to be clear. You need to be able to be understanding that other people don't necessarily speak your language first. And you need to be able to write it down. I say documentation capabilities. Yeah, just big fat write it down. Just think that. If you write it down and you can show that you know how to actually make it so that other people understand what's going on and where the decisions came from, that's documentation. You've heard the phrase, fake it until you make it. Don't fake it. Actually do it. Somebody will see it. And if you go, hey, I'm looking for a job, they'll hire you. If you don't believe it, my entire company was founded on, I want to do this full time. And somebody going, done. That's actually the end of the talk. Any questions?
Yeah, more comment than a question.
Okay.
So you mentioned a few times, like, listen to your customers. They know what they want. They know what they need.
Yes.
I do agree that, like, if I did that, I'd have like 200 checkboxes on my option system because like everybody wants a different thing. And so I mean, I do agree you have to listen to them, but sometimes You have to convince them, like, you don't really need that. Yes, but maybe you want that other thing that everybody else will be happy with. Or sure, they have a good input, but
right.
people sometimes are very focused on what they need, like what the civilian users you have need.
I'm 100% with you there. He's got a completely valid point. Everybody in the back heard? Yes? Okay. I wanted to make sure, because sometimes I need to repeat. When I say listen to your customers, I'm not saying listen to every single tiny petulant request. Okay? You're communicating openly. That means when the customer says, I want this thing and I want it really bad, and you go, does this fit? What about this? We can already do it this way. Does this fit your workflow? Maybe you don't fully understand the problem you're having. But because you're discussing this with them and you're discussing it in the open, you can come to the best solution for all parties instead of individual who just really wants 15 checkboxes, right? Maybe giving them an advanced option where they can put in a configuration file instead of checkboxes is the best choice. And that configuration file could actually solve like 15 other open tickets about needing to tweak something specifically for this environment or that cloud provider. So, very good point. Anyone else?
You wrote or said, hire anywhere. So we make the experiment. This only works if people are working then on really stand-alone topics, not in a team. Because currently we face again the issue. Some people stand up, while others go to bed, and so in the team there's never a way that all communicate together, but always they vote what they plan, and then you always have this one day shift in it.
Right, and that's a valid one, and we've seen this one in all of our teams, right? We have teams on all parts of the planet, and there are teams that are, 10 people in one location, and 5 people in another time zone, and then 3 more in another time zone on the other side of the planet. How do you work around that? That comes down to actually communicating. Right? If your team specifically wants to work with the people they can talk to immediately, maybe they need to broaden their horizons a little bit. It's not that they need to work on a specific task and only a specific task, but maybe they need to work as a team on smaller tasks that make the greater whole. Break it down farther. Use minimum viable changes instead of going, here's a feature set, here's a feature set, here's a feature set. Because then you do have these 3 people in this time zone did that, and then these 2 or 3 people in the next time zone went, what are you doing? Because there was a difference, and now you've got because they were in different time zones, possibly on other sides of the planet, this guy does something, this girl disagrees, this guy on the other side of the planet again disagrees with them, and you end up with a week of going back and forth due to time zones, right? And I think that's what you're trying to point out. I'm not saying this is ever perfect, but you need to have people that are open-minded about it. And they are willing to do things that are large tasks with a group of people that can do small tasks to reach that goal.
So you talk about communication, but that's not an easy thing to do, right? So
Not always.
sometimes it's not that. So in more traditional companies, you have a team that will do the communication with the customer, for example. So how do you do it? What's your you have a strategy for new employees?
So people can be uncomfortable communicating. This is a truth, right? Especially in engineering, we tend to attract more introverts. One of the things that we specifically do is let everyone in the company know that we actually want them to be whomever they are. Right? We want people to feel comfortable being who they are, saying what they think, and not being afraid of somebody else judging or deciding that their viewpoint is valid. We specifically breed that culture. Now, people say, well, culture fit, culture fit. We're not looking to make sure that everyone in our company has one single viewpoint we actually don't want everyone to have a single viewpoint. What we want is everyone to understand that they all have a voice. And that does take effort. And it does take a little while when a new person joins to say, no, really, walk up to the CEO. And I know I have people on my team who did not believe me. Just walk up to the CEO until they actually realized he's just another person. Right? When you're dealing with a customer, for example, or a loud community member, I'll put it that way, they're too still just another customer. If they're going to be disgraceful to your employees, are they a valued member of your community? Are they really worth it to be that kind of detriment to your internal people, your culture? Sometimes decisions do have to be made where someone has decided to go and make a threat. Cut them off. Don't allow it. Right? And I'm not saying this is always perfect, but there are people that within our own company who have said things that they shouldn't have. We ask them to own up to that fact. There are times that we have customers that say things that they really shouldn't. And we'll let the customer know that that behavior is not acceptable. But all you have to do in that regard is be firm. Explain to them that this is not acceptable to us, this is not acceptable to any party within our organization, whether it's internal or external. You can happily take your money and go home if it's a customer and that's paying you. If it's a community member, I don't care. We've got record of what you've done. I'm not going to laud it at you, but don't do it again. If it's an employee, we're going to sit and we're going to have discussions with them. We're going to try and understand where they were coming from. Make sure that they understand what they did, while not necessarily intentional, was something that was a detriment to making everyone in the company feel welcome and able to truly contribute.
So you mentioned that sometimes being private is okay, and I agree with that, like for security issues or customer information kind of things. But being like an open source product, it might happen that even with good faith, someone from the contribution side of it might come and find the bug and just expose it somehow. Are there any strategies to try to mitigate these kind of things? Or?
Trying to mitigate someone just publicly listing a bug, security information, for example, it comes down to documentation. If you haven't described how you want someone to disclose something, do you really expect them to follow the process that you want them to follow? Another thing of write it down. The first time it happens, you may not have a process yet, but that was a process you learned from the hard way. So take those lessons, take the discussion surrounding them, and write it down. And then the next time, they'll have something to go to. And you can say, if you have a security bug, here's our process, contact these people, please don't make it aired until X time. Right? Any other questions? No? Okay, well then thank you all for having me.